laughter in that ballroom was the kind that stays with a man long after the room empties. Daniel Whitfield stood near the back wall in a plain gray jacket and a pair of boots he had owned for 6 years, holding a glass of water he never touched, while the woman he once promised his whole life to smiled at him like he was something she had scraped off her shoe. "Still driving that old truck?" she said, loud enough for 3 tables to hear. "I guess divorce didn't teach you anything." The room erupted. Somewhere behind that laughter, Daniel felt something old and familiar settle into his chest. Not anger, not shame, just a quiet ache he had carried for 8 years. Then his phone buzzed once in his pocket. He glanced down. 2 words. "I'm outside." And for the first time all night, he smiled. Nobody in that ballroom noticed the smile. Nobody thought to ask why a man being humiliated in front of his old classmates would suddenly look calm, almost amused. They didn't know that 2 days earlier, in a glass office 40 floors above downtown Chicago, Daniel had signed his name on a deal worth $4.8 billion. They didn't know that the company whose products sat in half their kitchens, whose software ran on the phones in their pockets, whose logo was printed on delivery trucks they passed every single day, belonged to him. The woman mocking him for his truck had absolutely no idea who she was standing in front of. And that, more than anything else that night, was exactly how Daniel wanted it. Before we go further into how a broke, humiliated man became one of the most powerful business owners in the country, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We would love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click that subscribe button so you never miss one of our stories. To understand why Daniel Whitfield stood in that ballroom dressed like a man who had nothing, you have to understand who he actually was. He was 41 years old, born and raised in a small town in Ohio where everybody knew everybody's business before it happened. He still lived modestly. No flashy watches, no designer suits, no chauffeured cars waiting outside. He drove a 15-year-old pickup truck because it still ran fine and he saw no reason to replace something that worked. People who met him for the first time never guessed what he was worth. He liked it that way. So the question worth asking is this: why would a billionaire show up to a high school reunion in an old truck and a jacket from a discount store? Why did nobody in that room recognize the man who had quietly reshaped an entire industry? He didn't come there by accident. He came for a reason, but it wasn't the reason anyone in that ballroom would have guessed. To understand what brought him back to that town, you have to go back almost 20 years to a cramped 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, where much younger Daniel shared one pizza with a woman named Vanessa, because that was all they could afford that week. They laughed about it. They didn't have money, but they had each other, and back then that felt like enough. Daniel remembers the smell of that apartment, detergent drifting up through the floorboards, the sound of the dryers thumping below them at night. Vanessa used to fall asleep with her head on his chest, telling him someday they'd have a house with a real kitchen. He believed her. He believed in them. That memory, more than any boardroom or business deal, was the one Daniel carried the longest, because it was the last time their life together felt simple before everything started to change. Back then, Daniel and Vanessa used to walk to the corner store together on Friday nights, splitting a bag of chips because neither of them wanted to admit they couldn't afford much more than that. They'd sit on the fire escape outside their apartment window, watching cars pass below, making promises about the life they'd build once things got easier. Vanessa used to talk about wanting a garden someday. Nothing fancy, just a small patch of dirt where she could grow tomatoes. Daniel used to talk about wanting a workshop, a place where he could build things with his hands the way his father had taught him. Those conversations felt like blueprints back then, small and modest, but entirely their own. Neither of them could have predicted how far apart those blueprints would eventually drift, or how quickly comfort could turn to distance once real pressure entered their lives. The second memory that stayed with him wasn't as gentle. Daniel lost his factory job when the plant downsized, and for 8 months he couldn't find steady work. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, unopened at first, then late, then final notice. Vanessa started coming home later. She stopped asking how his day went. Small things changed first, the way she looked at him when he talked about job applications, the way she sighed when he mentioned another rejection. Respect doesn't disappear all at once. It leaves quietly, one disappointed glance at a time, until one day you look up and it's simply gone. Daniel noticed it happening and told himself it was stress, that things would go back to normal once he found work again. He was wrong, but he wouldn't understand how wrong for another few months. The third memory is the one Daniel doesn't talk about often, even now. He found her phone one evening, forgotten on the kitchen table while she showered, and a message lit up the screen from a name he didn't recognize. He wasn't the kind of man who went looking for reasons to be suspicious, but that message was impossible to misread. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match the neighbors would remember. Just a quiet conversation at the kitchen table, and Vanessa admitting what he already knew. The divorce that followed wasn't loud either. It was paper signed at a lawyer's office, boxes packed into the same old truck he still drove today, and one sentence Vanessa said to him on his way out the door that he never forgot. "You'll never become anything." She believed those words completely. What she didn't know was that someone else, someone Daniel hadn't even met yet, didn't believe them at all. The months after the divorce were the hardest of Daniel's life. Harder than losing the job. Harder than the marriage ending. He slept in his truck more nights than he'd like to admit, parked outside a 24-hour diner where the owner let him use the bathroom without asking questions. He sold his tools, his television, anything that could put gas in the tank or food on the table. He applied for loans and got rejected. He pitched a business idea to 3 different investors and got laughed out of 2 offices and ignored by the 3rd. Friends who used to invite him stopped calling. It's a strange kind of loneliness, watching people quietly decide you're not worth their time anymore. Daniel kept a small notebook during those months, writing down ideas at 2 in the morning by the dome light of his truck, refusing to let the exhaustion convince him to stop trying, even when everything around him suggested he should. During those months, Daniel developed a routine that kept him from unraveling completely. Every morning, regardless of how little sleep he'd gotten in the cab of his truck, he'd walk into the diner, order the cheapest coffee on the menu, and spend an hour writing down ideas before the breakfast rush made the booth impossible to hold on to. The owner, a woman named Diane who never asked questions she didn't need answers to, started leaving him the leftover toast from orders that got canceled. She never made it a big gesture. She'd just set the plate down without a word and walk away before he could thank her properly. Years later, after everything changed, Daniel would return to that same diner and quietly buy the building for her, transferring the deed in her name with no conditions attached. But back then, all he had was black coffee, a stack of notebooks, and a stubborn refusal to believe that this was how his story would end. It was during that stretch of his life that Daniel met the man who would change everything, though neither of them knew it at the time. His name was Walter Griggs, a retired engineer in his 70s who ran a small hardware store where Daniel picked up odd jobs sweeping floors and stocking shelves for cash. Walter didn't offer him money. He offered him something Daniel needed more: attention, and one piece of advice that took less than a minute to say, but reshaped the rest of Daniel's life. Walter told him that most people fail not because their idea is bad, but because they give up the moment it gets difficult, right before it would have worked. He told Daniel to stop chasing investors who didn't understand his idea and start proving it could work with what little he had. That single conversation, spoken over a cash register in a dusty hardware store, would eventually help build a billion-dollar company. If you've ever had to rebuild your life from nothing after losing almost everything you had, we want to hear from you. Let us know where you're watching from and share your story with us in the comments below, because stories like Daniel's remind us that rock bottom isn't always the end. Sometimes it's simply where the real work begins. Daniel took Walter's advice seriously. He stopped waiting for permission and started building with what he had: a second-hand laptop, a stack of notebooks, and stubborn refusal to quit. His first real venture failed within a year, a logistics app that ran out of funding before it ever found its footing. His second attempt lasted 18 months before a bigger competitor swallowed the market whole. Most men would have stopped there. Daniel didn't, because Walter's words kept echoing in his mind every time he wanted to give up. His third idea, a supply chain platform built to solve the exact problem that had cost him his old factory job, finally caught the attention of a small group of investors who saw what nobody else had bothered to look for. Slowly, painfully, it started to work. Contracts came in, then bigger contracts, then a partnership that changed the trajectory of the entire company almost overnight. There were nights during those early building years when Daniel questioned whether Walter's advice had been right at all. He remembers one particular evening, sitting alone in a small rented office with the lights off to save on the electric bill, staring at a spreadsheet of numbers that didn't add up no matter how many times he recalculated them. He called Walter that night, not for money, but just to hear someone tell him it made sense to keep going. Walter didn't offer sympathy. He simply asked Daniel one question: had he actually solved the problem he set out to solve, or had he just built something easier to explain to investors? That question sat with Daniel for weeks. It was the reason he eventually rebuilt the entire platform from the ground up, stripping away everything that wasn't essential, focusing only on the one problem that had cost him his factory job years earlier. That decision, uncomfortable as it was, ended up being the turning point that made everything else possible. The years that followed moved faster than Daniel ever expected. What started as a two-person operation working out of a rented office above a dry cleaner became a company with headquarters spanning an entire city block. Acquisitions followed, then international expansion, then a name that started appearing in business magazines Daniel used to flip through at the grocery store checkout line without ever imagining he'd be featured inside one. Reporters wanted interviews. Universities wanted him to speak at graduation ceremonies. Through all of it, Daniel kept one part of his life carefully separate from the rest. Nobody from his hometown knew what he had built. Not his old neighbors, not his former co-workers, and certainly not Vanessa. He preferred it that way, not out of shame, but because he had learned the hard way that people treat you differently once they know what you're worth, and he'd had enough of being valued for the wrong reasons. But someone from that reunion already knew exactly who he'd become, and he was about to find out how. Which brings us back to the ballroom, to the reunion Daniel almost didn't attend, to the laughter still echoing off the walls as his former classmates showed off luxury cars parked outside and vacation homes they'd bought in the mountains. Vanessa moved through the crowd like she owned it, her new husband's watch catching the light every time he raised his glass. She noticed Daniel's plain jacket immediately, the same way a hawk notices movement in tall grass, and she couldn't resist circling back to him a second time. The comments got sharper. She compared his old truck to her husband's new one. She mentioned his simple clothes loud enough for the table beside them to hear. A few people laughed along with her, the way people do when they're afraid of becoming the next target themselves. Near the far side of the room, an older gentleman in a well-tailored suit watched quietly, checking his watch every few minutes, saying nothing, waiting. A few tables away, a group of former classmates compared notes on their latest vacations, one describing a trip to the coast, another mentioning a second home they'd recently closed on in the mountains. Vanessa's husband, a broad-shouldered man in an expensive blazer, kept glancing at his watch as if checking to make sure everyone had noticed it. Daniel recognized the type. He'd spent years in rooms full of people like that, people who measured worth in visible things, in labels and logos, and the size of a driveway. He didn't resent them for it. He simply understood, better than most, how little any of that actually said about a person's character. He thought briefly about Walter, about the dusty hardware store and the cash register and the advice that cost nothing but changed everything. None of that would have meant anything to the people at this reunion. And that, Daniel realized, was exactly the point. Vanessa wasn't finished. Emboldened by the laughter, she leaned closer to Daniel with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and asked the question loud enough for half the ballroom to hear. So, did life ever work out for you? The room went quiet enough that Daniel could hear the ice shifting in someone's glass 3 tables away. One classmate, a woman named Grace who had always been kinder to him than most, opened her mouth to defend him, but Vanessa cut her off with a look sharp enough to end the conversation before it started. Daniel took his time answering. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for anger, though he had every right to. He simply looked at Vanessa, calm and steady, and said, "It worked out better than I expected." A few people chuckled, assuming it was a polite deflection. But across the room, the older gentleman in the tailored suit rose from his chair, and every head slowly turned to follow him. The man walked directly toward Daniel, extending his hand with the kind of respect usually reserved for someone important, and said 2 words that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. "Mr. Chairman." The laughter died instantly. Vanessa's smile froze halfway on her face. The older gentleman, whose name was Richard Alden, thanked Daniel warmly for the thousands of jobs his company had created across 3 states, then casually mentioned that nearly everyone in that ballroom had unknowingly used products built by Daniel's company at some point that very week. Phones came out. Names were typed into search bars. Faces shifted from confusion to disbelief within seconds. The man they had spent the last hour mocking for his old truck and simple jacket was worth more than every luxury car parked outside that building combined. And the biggest surprise of the night hadn't even arrived yet. Daniel's phone buzzed one more time. 2 words lit up the screen. "I'm here." The ballroom doors opened, and the noise inside the room dropped to near silence as elegant footsteps echoed across the floor. A woman walked in with quiet confidence, dressed simply but unmistakably, and half the room recognized her immediately, not because of tabloids or gossip columns, but because she was one of the most respected business leaders in the country, someone whose name appeared in serious publications for serious reasons. She crossed the room, wrapped her arms around Daniel, and smiled. "Sorry I'm late," she said softly, as if she hadn't just silenced an entire ballroom. Her name was Catherine, and she wasn't a fantasy Daniel had invented to save face. She was real, accomplished in her own right, and standing beside him with the kind of quiet pride that comes from genuinely knowing someone. Vanessa, for the first time all evening, had nothing to say. What happened next unfolded slowly, the way truth often does once people stop being distracted by appearances. Former classmates began sharing stories nobody had connected until that moment. A scholarship fund that had quietly paid for a local student's entire college education, an anonymous donor who had covered a young mother's medical bills after a car accident left her unable to work, a community center built in the poorest part of town that nobody could ever trace back to a name. Every single one of those acts of generosity led back to Daniel, given without his name attached, without any expectation of recognition. Even the very venue hosting their reunion existed because of a foundation Daniel had quietly funded years earlier. Vanessa stood frozen as the pieces came together, slowly realizing she had spent an entire marriage standing beside a man she never actually understood, and an entire evening mocking a stranger she had built in her own imagination. Just when the room believed it had absorbed the full weight of the evening, one more truth emerged, and it was the one that mattered most. Catherine gently explained why they had actually come to the reunion that night, and it had nothing to do with revenge or proving a point to anyone in that ballroom. They had come to announce a new scholarship fund, one named after Mrs. Donnelly, the high school teacher who had believed in Daniel back when almost nobody else did, back when he was failing 2 classes and convinced he'd never amount to much of anything. The first recipient of that scholarship, Catherine explained, was the daughter of one of Daniel's former classmates, a young woman working 2 jobs while attending community college, determined to build something better for herself. Even Vanessa's own niece would benefit from the program in the years ahead. Daniel had every reason in the world to choose bitterness that night, and instead, he chose generosity without hesitation. The room, which had spent the entire evening shifting between laughter and shock, finally settled into something quieter, something closer to reflection. Vanessa stood near the edge of the crowd, no longer smiling, no longer performing for an audience, simply watching a man she once dismissed stand taller than she ever imagined he could. A few people noticed her eyes glistening before she quietly excused herself from the room. Daniel didn't chase after her, didn't seek her out for one final word. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said by the life he had built in the years since she walked out that door. Sometimes the most powerful response to someone who doubted you isn't a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it's simply becoming exactly who you always believed you could be, quietly, patiently, without needing anyone's permission or approval along the way. Later that night, after most of the ballroom had emptied and the caterers had begun clearing the tables, Daniel stood near the same wall where he'd been standing hours earlier, holding the same untouched glass of water. Catherine slipped her hand into his, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. He thought about the apartment above the laundromat, the smell of detergent drifting through the floorboards, the pizza they used to split because it was all they could afford. He thought about sleeping in his truck outside that diner, about Walter's advice spoken over a cash register, about every rejection that came before the acceptances finally arrived. None of it had been easy. None of it had happened the way he expected when he was younger, and certain his life was falling apart beyond repair. But somehow, impossibly, it had led him here. I spent years wanting people to regret losing me, Daniel said quietly, more to himself than to Catherine, though she listened all the same. Then one day, I realized peace is worth far more than revenge. He thought about how easy it would have been to walk into that reunion with something to prove, to flaunt everything he'd built just to watch Vanessa's face fall. But that kind of victory never lasts. It burns bright for a moment and leaves nothing behind but the same emptiness that started it. Real success, Daniel had come to understand, doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need applause or recognition or someone else's regret to feel complete. Sometimes it simply waits quietly in the background of your life, doing its work until the day it speaks for itself without you ever having to raise your voice. If someone in your life ever underestimated you, doubted you, or told you that you'd never amount to anything, we want to know how you proved them wrong, or how you're still working on proving them wrong today. Tell us your story in the comments below. We read every single one, and we genuinely love to hear how you turned doubt into determination. And if you were in that ballroom tonight, watching Daniel's story unfold in front of you, we want to know honestly, would you have recognized him for who he really was, or would you have laughed along with everyone else, the way so many of us do when we judge people by what they're wearing instead of who they actually are underneath it? On the drive home that night, Catherine asked Daniel if he felt any satisfaction from how the evening had unfolded. He thought about it for a long moment before answering honestly. He said the satisfaction wasn't in Vanessa's reaction, or in the way the room had gone silent, or even in Richard Alden calling him Mr. Chairman in front of people who once overlooked him without a second thought. The real satisfaction, he said, came earlier, back in that hardware store with Walter, back in that diner booth with Diane's quiet kindness, back in every version of himself that kept showing up even when nothing was working. Those were the moments that actually built the life he now had. The reunion was simply the night that life happened to become visible to people who hadn't been paying attention. Catherine reached over and squeezed his hand, and for the rest of the drive, neither of them felt the need to say much else at all. There's something worth sitting with in Daniel's story, something beyond the billions and the boardrooms and the quiet acts of generosity nobody knew about until that night. It's a reminder that the loudest victory in life isn't making someone regret losing you. It's building something so meaningful, so rooted in who you actually are, that their opinion simply stops mattering at all. Daniel didn't need Vanessa's approval that night, and he certainly didn't need the ballroom's applause. What he had built over those 8 hard years was never about proving anyone wrong in the first place. It was about becoming the man Walter Griggs believed he could be, the man Mrs. Donnelly saw potential in long before anyone else did, the man Catherine chose to stand beside, not because of what he owned, but because of who he was underneath all of it. A few weeks after the reunion, Daniel received a handwritten letter from Grace, the classmate who had tried to defend him that night. She wrote that she'd spent years assuming her own quiet struggles made her invisible in a room full of people chasing bigger houses and better titles, and that watching him stand there unbothered by all of it had reminded her that visibility was never really the point. Daniel kept that letter in his desk drawer, not because it changed anything about his life, but because it reminded him why he'd chosen to keep so much of his success private in the first place. Not everyone needs to know what you've built. Sometimes the people who matter most are the ones who noticed you long before the rest of the world did, quietly, without needing proof. Success doesn't always announce itself the moment it arrives. Sometimes it waits patiently in an old truck parked outside a diner, in a notebook filled with 2 in the morning ideas, in a conversation with a stranger who saw something worth investing in when nobody else would. Daniel's story isn't really about becoming a billionaire at all, not in the way people usually imagine wealth. It's about what a person chooses to do with everything they've earned once they finally have it, whether they choose bitterness or generosity, revenge or peace. Daniel chose peace, and in doing so, he gave a room full of people something far more valuable than a moment of humiliation to remember him by. He gave them a scholarship named after a teacher who once believed in a struggling kid nobody else took seriously. Before you go, take a moment to think about your own story, about the moments in your life where someone doubted you, dismissed you, or told you that you'd never become anything. Think about how far you've come since then, or how far you're still determined to go. Life has a strange way of rewarding patience over pride, and quiet persistence over loud proof. If this story moved you tonight, if it reminded you of your own journey, or someone you know who's still fighting their way back from rock bottom, please take a moment to like this video, and if you haven't already, subscribe for more stories like this one so you never miss what's coming next. And click on the next video on your screen, because you honestly won't want to miss the story waiting for you there.